is Christian patriotism? Is it biblical? And how should believers understand the war with Iran? All of that is coming up. Stick with us. Over the last few years, conversations about Christian nationalism and what it means to be a patriotic American have swirled constantly. It's been a difficult conversation to parse, so here on Faith and Culture, we're going to talk about that. I'm your host, Tré Goins-Phillips, and to help us decipher some of this is author Daniel Darling. Dan, it's good to have you here, and you recently wrote a book called In Defense of Christian Patriotism. Now, first, before we get into some of the contents of the book, tell us what it was that really inspired you to write it.
Well, I wrote it for a couple of reasons. One, I've always had a patriotic sense. I grew up in a very patriotic household. My grandfather was a second generation American who fought in World War II as a tank commander. So I was very proud of that. When I was a kid, my parents packed up our station wagon in the Chicago area and we drove to Washington, D.C. And, that sort of opened up that world to me. And I've always loved history and politics and all that stuff. Always had a profound sense of love for this country. But I think also sensing a need as we approach our 250th anniversary, that there's a real crisis of gratitude about the country. I think there's a real crisis of patriotism. Even among Christians. And I run into a lot of well-meaning, Bible-believing Christians who are a little nervous about expressing any love for the country. A lot of it is because they've been fed this steady diet of things that basically say, if you love your country, you're idolatrous, that you can only love God and you can't love your country. If you're engaged and care about public policy, that somehow that's dangerous or wrong. And so I wanted to kind of give Christians a little bit of way to think about, how do I love God? How do I love my country? How can I do it well?
You differentiate in the book between nationalism, which is a buzzword that is getting so much attention, and also patriotism. So tell us how, Dan, you would define each and why that distinction between nationalism and patriotism is so important.
Yeah, I really don't love the term nationalism because it's become, as you know, a pejorative to be used by the left against anybody who, like me, like you, we love our country, we love God, we have desires for what we'd like to see our country be. We understand our country has Christian influence and roots. So I don't like that. It's been wielded as a pejorative that way. But I do think there is a subset of people who are dissatisfied with the way things are and feel like maybe the Constitution is not workable, not a good idea. We need to have some sort of state church or theocracy or something like that. And of course, I believe in the Constitution. I think the founders were wise. And as a Baptist, I believe that Christians should be engaged in public policy, that the country has a profound Christian influence and roots. But we don't want the government to tell people how to believe or what to believe, or we don't want them to have that kind of power. So I differentiate there. But I want to give people a place to land to say, if you love the country, if you're deeply patriotic, if you care about the country, if you want to roll up your sleeves and get involved, that doesn't make you a Christian nationalist. That doesn't make you dangerous. And you can do that in a way that's rightly ordered with your love for God.
And, there are a lot of people, to your point about the United States being founded on biblical Judeo-Christian principles. Talk about some of that, because I know that is so often an attack that's lobbed against people who are proud of their country, who are Christians, who want to be Christian patriots. I'll say, well, we need the separation of church and state, that there are not those Christian roots that you suggest there are. What would be your response to that criticism?
Well, I would say if you really study the founding and the founders, not every founder was an evangelical Christian as we would describe, and not all of them were Orthodox believers. They had varying views, and yet they were all steeped in Christianity. They couldn't help themselves. I mean, even someone like Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson, who were what you would probably consider Unitarians. They, believed in divine providence, but didn't believe in the miracles and things like that. They appreciated Christianity. They talked about providence. They understood that for this experiment in human government and ordered liberty to work, that you'd have to have a really thick layer of religion and virtue, and I would argue Christianity, for this thing to work. And our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence acknowledges that our rights don't come from the government, they come from God. They have to come from somewhere. And so, they definitely did not want a state church. They didn't want the government to tell people how to believe, how to worship. And I don't think we should want that either. I think that's not the government's job. At the same time, I don't think they envisioned secularism, where you push Christianity out of the public square to the point that in the latter half of the 20th century, this idea of the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment was used actually to punish Christian witness. And so thankfully the court has pulled some of that back. So we shouldn't be afraid to say, yeah, our laws have a moral basis, and to have our leaders and politicians who are Christians to express that. That's not nationalism. That's not dangerous. It's actually in keeping with American tradition. I mean, if you look through a lot of our history, many of our leaders on both sides of the aisle acknowledge the Christian roots of America. I mean, if you read FDR's prayer before D-Day, it's really steeped in Christian language. For this to work, for ordered liberty to work, you have to have a moral basis. Richard John Newhouse said this about 40 years ago in his book, The Naked Public Square, but there's no such thing as a naked or neutral public square. Something will fill that. The founders understood this. I don't think we should be ashamed of that. And when we talk about the Christian roots of the country, we shouldn't be shy about that at all.
Would you say that in order really to live out the freedoms that are laid out in our Declaration and then enshrined in our Constitution, that you need to have a moral framework? It seems
Absolutely.
like the founders envisioned, to your point, all of us being Bible believers in the country, or Christians, people who believed in a God. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the founders understood that not every citizen would be a Christian, and they wanted to protect. They worked this out even as the states were thinking through establishment and disestablishment. They wanted to work that out. But they understood not everyone would be a Christian, or a Christian in the way they envisioned. Even some of the Baptist forefathers talked about liberty for Jewish people and Muslims and all that kind of stuff, freedom to worship. And yet they really understood that there's a basic moral truth. And I would argue that is revealed, as we would see, in natural law, where God has revealed a lot of truth in creation that can be accessed, but even by people who don't necessarily believe the Bible. There's a basic moral truth. And if you lose that, you don't have a basis for laws and for legislation. People say, well, you can't legislate morality. Well, every law is an expression of morality, right? So the founders really understood that. And if you lose that moral center, if you lose that moral core, things turn to chaos. They turn to moral anarchy. And, for America to flourish, yes, we need to pass good laws. We need to be involved. We need to elect good leaders. But really, we need spiritual and moral renewal. And Christians should pray earnestly for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of things we ought to pray for, in our next segment, I want to talk to you, Dan, about the operation unfolding against Iran. I think that's something that as Christians we ought to be informed about and be praying for, of course. So we're going to finish a quick break, but everybody stick with us. We'll be right back with more Faith and Culture. Welcome back to this week's episode of Faith and Culture. We're talking with Dan Darling about Christian patriotism, but we're also going to talk about current events, because that's something that I know so many of you are curious about. It's something that we're praying through and kind of struggling at times, Dan, to understand, which is the operation currently ongoing against Iran now. So how, as Christians, should we even kind of frame what is happening right now?
Well, I think the way we should think about it is that this is not a war that just began. In a certain sense, Iran has been at war with the United States and really the whole West for almost 50 years. Ever since the overthrow of the Shah back in the latter part of the 20th century, the 70s. This is a regime that has killed a lot of Americans. They've held Americans hostage. They funded a lot of the terror around the world. They funded October 7th. They funded a lot of the IEDs and roadside bombs that have killed our soldiers in Iraq. They have claimed and pledged. They call us the big Satan, and Israel the little Satan. And so this has been a bully that has been an obstacle for peace around the world. And so on one level, we really should, in some ways, celebrate the demise of a wicked ruler that not only terrorized his neighbors, but terrorized his own people, kept women under subjugation, had no religious liberty. At the same time, war is really hard and difficult. None of us should long for war. None of us should be gleeful for it. We should be sober-minded. I think the president and his team are appropriately sober-minded. We know that Trump is not eager for war, but sometimes understands you have to take action to actually bring about peace. I'm encouraged by the coalition of Arab nations that have come alongside us. I don't think I've ever seen anything like this, where the Arab nations and Israel and the United States are really, in a sense, united, and Europe, it seems like. But war is hard and difficult. We should pray for a successful conclusion to the war, that perhaps Iran will have a regime there that maybe they won't be as democratic as we would like, but at least a little bit more like that might have human rights and freedom. Pray for the Christian movement in Iran. There's I think I saw someone say there's several million evangelical Christians that have been really living out their faith in an oppressive country. And Iran has historic Christian roots. And so we should pray for a return of that. And pray for the people of Iran, pray for its neighbors, pray for peace. We also need to pray for Israel. They're a target here. Iran has been lobbing missiles every day. Israelis are on bomb shelters. And so, and ultimately pray for the president and his team to make wise decisions as they execute this war.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this is a good time to mention too to our audience that CBN News, CBN has been doing a lot of work to share the gospel in the country of Iran, a lot of times clandestinely sharing the gospel. So if you want to learn more about that or even contribute to the effort, you can go to cbn.com and get more information on that. And Dan, another thing that I wanted to ask you is, per our earlier segment, we were talking about really the moral compass that the United States was founded on. And when it comes to operations like this, efforts to topple who was by pretty much every possible metric, the Ayatollah Khomeini, one of the most evil and sinister leaders I think that the world has ever seen. What role and responsibility does the United States have, not just to lead militarily, but ultimately to lead morally?
That's a great question. Most Christians throughout history have subscribed to some version of what's called just war theory, and I won't elaborate on that for your audience in an academic sense, but it basically says that, the government does bear the sword at times to reward good and punish evil. Good governments will not allow their people to be attacked and preyed upon. But just war says, is this a just cause? Is there a chance of victory here? And the way we conduct ourselves in that war matters. We don't intentionally target civilians and all those kinds of things. The U.S. Is the world superpower. We do have a responsibility in the world. I think the idea that we can just sort of put our head in the sand and pretend this world doesn't exist is just not realistic, because the world is interconnected and all those problems eventually come home. Now, I do think we can't be the world's policeman. We can't go everywhere and solve every problem. We shouldn't, because the first responsibility to, for the president and Congress and all are their own citizens. However, there are times when those things align, where we have a real interest in Iran not being a nuclear power. We have a real interest in them not having nuclear weapons that could reach our cities or that could hurt our soldiers at bases around the world. We have a real interest in the Middle East having peace for trade and flourishing and all those kinds of things. And so every decision like this to go into conflict has to be weighed very carefully. Just because it's a just cause doesn't mean we should get involved. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. I think the president and his team have appropriately deliberated. We've been reading for months that they've been weighing this decision. He has heard from all sides. He's got people in his cabinet that are more hawkish on this. He's got folks who are a little bit concerned. It's good to have both so that you really understand the stakes. But I do think it was the right decision. But we do need to pray for the unfolding of it, and that they can get a good regime that can work with us, and that people would be cared for. So it's very complex, and we really need to pray that this resolves well and the conflict ends sooner rather than later.
And, another piece, Dan, to the complexity of this is the expansion of anti-Semitism around the world, but also this anti-Israel sentiment that we're seeing in the U.S., particularly amongst younger conservatives. So this is a two-part question I want to ask you is, one, what do you think is driving that? And two, what do you think the solution to that is?
That's a great question. I'm dismayed as you are by the rising anti-Semitism. After the horror of October 7th, you would have thought the world would rally to Israel, and there was a point where they did, but immediately also there's this huge, massive backlash to Israel. The victims who have been, persecuted and attacked for all of their history. I expect anti-Semitism from the left now, sadly, because it used to be bipartisan. Support for Israel used to be bipartisan. The left has really become, for the most part, anti-Israel, with a few exceptions like John Fetterman and others. What I'm really dismayed by is to see portions of the right embrace this. And I on one hand, I'm very, very dismayed by folks like Tucker and others who are spreading this. It's very distressing. It's very wrong. Christians should stand against it. And I think it threatens to not only hurt Israel and hurt Jewish people, but hurt the conservative movement. On the other hand, I'm optimistic at the width and depth of conservative opposition to this. And I've looked at some recent polling. Chosen People Ministries and other folks have done some really good in-depth research. And it shows that when it comes to at least evangelicals are still strongly supportive of Israel and the right to exist. But I think we have to continue to share with the next generation why Israel has to exist. And I think first, there's a shared spiritual heritage with Christians. I think secondly, the enemies of Israel are the enemies of the West. And, those who want to destroy the West and our way of life first come after Israel, and then they come after us. So just saying that they first come for the Saturday people, and then they come for the Sunday people. They first come for the Jews, and they come for the Christians. And that's true. And so Christians, it's incumbent for us to stand up for them. People have different views of eschatology, different views of the end times. That's been the case for all of church history, but that doesn't mean that you turn your back on Israel. And I still do think God has promises for Israel. And whether you believe that or not, when you look at the situation, it's really not a two sides thing. I think the just and right and noble thing is to stand up for them. They're the only democracy in that part of the world. If you understand the history after the Holocaust, that Jewish people could not trust their host countries to protect them after World War II. So this is where Zionism began with, they need their own place, their own country. So I just think, Christians need to stand up against this. I think it's a cheap and easy way to get page views and clicks to take this anti-Israel position. But I think it's wrong. I think it's wicked. And hopefully our leaders will have the institutional fortitude to stand against it. I've been surprised. I know the president has a lot of flaws, but he has been good on Israel and good for Israel and is working really strongly with them. And I've seen other leaders as well, but let's hope that continues.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, this is an all important issue, as you said, Dan, no matter where you fall on the theological spectrum. This is an important issue and one that we as Christians ought to be raising our voices about. So it's important to discuss this. And we're going to fit in a quick break, but we'll be right back with more Faith and Culture. Everybody stick with us. Welcome back to Faith and Culture. We're speaking with Dan Darling. And Dan, as Christians, ultimately, how can we be in prayer for the Trump administration, the Israeli government, the Christians in Iran? How can we just be praying about all that's going on right now?
That's a great prayer or a great question. First of all, we need to pray for the president and Congress that God would give them wisdom and that they would have good influences around them and good people in their ear, and unwise voices would not be in their ear. We know from scripture that God moves in the hearts of kings like he moves rivers. So pray for them, pray for Congress, pray for Republicans and Democrats that they would lead wisely and lead well in these complicated times. We need to pray for revival and renewal in our country and spiritual revival and renewal. Pray for unity. I know we all have different beliefs and systems. We should stand up for those, but we should also pray that we can have civic unity that we need in America. I also think we should pray for the church. I don't think there's, the church is as important now as it's ever been. And we have the message of hope, the message of eternal life, the message that Christ is making all things new. People are scared, they're nervous, they're worried, and we have the message that of hope. So we need to pray for them and, pray ultimately that we can get peace in Iran. And I pray that God gives them a season of liberty and freedom, that the gospel can pour into that nation, church planting and evangelism. Wouldn't that be incredible to see? What if in 10, 15 years, you look and Iran is like a hub of gospel activity around the Middle East? That would be incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, amen to all of that. The book is In Defense of Christian Patriotism by Daniel Darling. You can get that wherever you get your books. Dan, I so appreciate you being willing to come on today.
Well, thank you for having me, Tré, and just love the great work you're doing, the great work CBN is doing here and around the world.
Awesome. Thank you so much again for being here. Everybody stick with us. We'll be right back to wrap up this week's episode. That is all the time we have for this week's episode of Faith and Culture. Thank you so much for being here. If you want more news from a Christian perspective, head on over to cbnnews.com. Also, check out our Quick Start podcast. It goes out every weekday morning, and we break down the news from a gospel perspective. Again, thank you so much for being here, and God bless you.